Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about Season 3, the first 4 episodes of Season 3 of Black Mirror. So I'd caught these episodes last night. I probably could have watched the rest of the season and just been done with it. But recently I was just like, hey, like I'll just kind of look at these episodes and then ultimately just kind of like call it at that because ultimately I had to start watching The Mandalorian. And so recently it was just like, meh, like these were just kind of easy episodes, just kind of call for another review. And then I will probably finish season 3 and then get to the rest of season 4. I don't know how exactly I'm going to review those because recently it's just like, well, like I'll have to do two different things. Like, yeah, hey, this is part of season 3, and then here's season 4. Like we'll see how that review ends up going to finish up. Maybe I'll just kind of do a 2 episode review to finish up season 3 and then go into season 4. Um, I have seen all the way through all these seasons, but when looking at it, recently there is some stuff that I don't quite remember about certain episodes. And I think the very last episode of season 3, I don't really much remember at all. Just because really, like, to me, it felt like a episode that was just kind of like, man, this episode is just, there's not much into it. There's not, to me, a good enough season ending episode. But I guess it's just like, well, we had to shove this episode in here somewhere, and here it is. So, going into this, the first 4 episodes of season 3, ultimately, the very first episode of season 3, of course, I've mentioned that it's my favorite episode, Nosedive, just because reason I felt that, like, here is where we could possibly escalate our world to have it be like, well, YouTube kind of does influencers and stuff like that. So, what if we kind of took that and just made that like our life now, where basically instead of money, instead of whatever, we just have to be overly forcibly nice to people or be able to have people just enjoy and or like everything that we do. And if they don't, then it's going to hurt ourselves at the end of the day. Anyways, so going into these 4 episodes, I would ultimately say that reasonably, like, we get the episode called Playtest, where ultimately there, I would probably say for some people that some people may not like this episode. I would say for some people that may get a little bit of grossed out or ultimately might be maybe getting to a thing where people could easily get scared, maybe more than likely avoid this episode compared to everything else. Because really, the whole goal of playtest is to basically get scared or get terrified or whatever. Because ultimately, really, that episode deals with spiders and deals with uh, a video game that goes horribly awry. And but interestingly enough, in the play test episode, ultimately the guy who ends up being focal pointed in that episode is also going to be in the Falcon Winter Soldier show. Ultimately, knowing full well Anthony Mackie at some point in one of these episodes, I think in the next season, is also going to be in one of these Black Mirror episodes as well. So yeah, that was really interesting to ultimately see Anthony Mackie being on one of these episodes. So also, we have consistently here some interesting journeys, and basically, we have to where, like, a lot of episodes where it's just like, well, hey, like, what happens if somebody is going to take control of your life and ultimately blackmail you into forcibly doing something that you do not want to do? And then ultimately, because ultimately they're going to blackmail you, hold something over you, and then eventually to the point where you have to do whatever they say, but they're just gonna keep going after you and keep dogging you to do any number of things that'll see how like see how far that they can push you. So, and then in the last episode, we have this virtual world like journey that really pushes the fact of like, well, hey, like, uh, what happens when people are seemingly at the end of their rope, at the end of their journey, and really they just need a world that is not quite their own to enjoy what is the rest of their I guess life, I would say. So yeah, just an interesting episodes, but let's go into just really just breaking all these down and calling it a day. So anyways, let's go into that double five spoiler time journey. I like some of these episodes every once in a while, like kind of like Black Mirror. It's just kind of like not all of them are going to be home runs. Sometimes some even episodes are just kind of like, man, this one's kind of boring. I think the last episode that I had mentioned, like I think that one is just kind of like, man, this one is just a little bit boring to me. Excuse me. This one was a little bit like, man, I'm like, they really were just drawing this story out, and it seemed like this one had like the least amount of like real true special effects going on, and real like it was just kind of a story that I'm like, man, this story is just kind of just it's boring. It's boring to be brutally honest. But anyways, so let's go out of our way to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I spoil this show. Um, so going into these four episodes, let's go into Nosedive. So Nosedive, to me, the thing that I think is my favorite thing about it is the fact that we have a different way of income instead of just normal money. And also, it seems that we have to manipulate people to try to become uh, more, to have more, what they would have the equivalent of money. Because ultimately, you have to be a prime influencer. You have to be a prime member and stuff like that. And so, ultimately, there are some people that will simply slip under the cracks just because of a barely different number that ultimately changes slightly, and to where ultimately they're just like, oh, well, you can't go on a plane now, or you can't. Oh, hey, yeah, you want to rent a car? Well, you're gonna get the shittiest car because ultimately, like, you are only at this number right now, and so we have it to where we have this girl. I don't have the actor's details because ultimately through every episode to episode, every actor changes. I believe that the girl that plays in this nosedive episode is the daughter of Ron Howard. So yeah, that's interesting. Ultimately, I realized that she had been in Jurassic Worlds, and she had also directed a episode of The Mandalorian, the first season. So going into this, we have to where this girl is ultimately desperately trying to get to a seemingly 4.5, and she is evidently had hired a consultant to ultimately try and get her to a 4.5 because she wants a better living arrangement. She wants to be able to uh, seemingly better portion of life. And here's the interesting thing that I thought was really funny about this episode. So we have this girl that ultimately goes to this cafe to get this cookie and to get this coffee, and so ultimately she ends up eating this or taking a big bite out of this cookie, which ultimately she does not eat because she hates it. and then she ends up taking a thing of coffee or whatever this is, whatever this drink is, and she hates that too. But ultimately, she just wants to showcase that it seemed that she ate this, to showcase this on her feed, to where it looks like she is a like, oh, look at this interesting meal that I ate. Wow, wow, look how wonderful it is, even though she ate none of it and she barely drank any of it and she hated it. And like, I just thought that that was so weird. So this girl goes throughout her day to ultimately just kind of jog around and ultimately 5-star everyone that she sees, 5-star all their photos. She goes through every single person's social medias and 5 stars everything, because reasonably that's where you have these people that are all fake people. And you have to where this girl is mentioning to some other guy, hey, yeah, I love that photo of you and your son. Yeah, I know. Yeah, he's growing to be so good and whatever. You have this girl who eventually goes into this elevator and is talking to some woman, and ultimately she is offering her some food that she ate from somewhere, because ultimately we have to where like these food services and these just services in general are all not actually going to give people the best experience, because they don't have to, because reasonably like they have to give them a 5-star experience, and so does the places that end up talking to her. So we push on to have this girl just consistently like trying to get to a bump of 4.5, and recently instead we just have it to where ultimately she goes to her work, and ultimately it seems like there is some Chester like guy that seems to be desperate to get bumped on stars, because ultimately he broke up with somebody. And so we have his coworkers that are basically saying like, yeah, well, hey, like if anything, like their relationship, these two guys, they broke up, and so we're on the side of this one guy, and so we're gonna just treat this other guy like garbage, give him 1 stars or 2 stars, so that way it can consistently bump him down, to where he can no longer work here, because he can't even get into the building, and we're just gonna just kind of like kind of downgrade him out to where he just can't he's not able to do anything. And we have it to where uh this main girl seeks pity on Chester, but ultimately there's nothing she can do about it. And ultimately, while her other coworkers are hearing some of the stuff that she ends up saying, and so they are like down starring her, and she's like, "Well, so she ends up going to an influencer, a guy that is otherwise going to tell her how to do her to bump her up to 4.5, and so he's ultimately telling her, it's like, well, hey, you need much more substantial people that are going to like, you need bigger fish in this small pond to get you up to 4.5. So recently, that's when we have it to where this girl is kind of changing who she is, kind of doing these fake laughs, doing this seemingly much even more fake persona to otherwise sneer these bigger influencers. And her brother is playing video games to otherwise get his stars. And so reasonably you just have to where uh, like the guy that is speaking to his sister is realizing how much he has drastically changed, and he doesn't like her. Like, he doesn't like that she's changing to be in this in crowd that ultimately actually didn't help her, didn't like treated her like garbage when she was a kid. And but ultimately we have it to where this this influencer, this woman that I know from the Star Trek movie reboot with Chris Pine, and ultimately she was in she's out of our league, or she's out of your league. She ultimately comes in and she is this girl that is this girl that's going to marry that is going to get married to this guy that ultimately I know from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles CGI thing, and ultimately a number of DC comic book like stuff. Ultimately to be one half of Hawk and Dove on Teen Titans or Titans. Ultimately being also Aquaman from Smallville, and so on and so forth. So reasonably, we have these interactions between this influencer and this main focal pointed girl. They're talking back and forth about rags, and they're talking about like, oh my god, you're getting married! I can't believe you're getting married. This girl, the entire time, every single time she talks to everyone, is in a bathing suit the entire time, and I'm like, or in like the skimpiest clothes that she can possibly wear. And I'm like, oh, okay, so that's how she's like getting everybody to 5-star her, because she's wearing like the skimpiest clothes. So reasonably, we have it to where this girl is asking her old friend of hers to be her maid of honor, and she's like, "Oh yeah, this is great. Yeah, I definitely would be a maid of honor for you." And so now we have to get this main girl to this wedding, and so reasonably we have it to where she's desperate to get a flight out, but it seems like every single one of the flights are booked. And so this girl is just like, well, can you help me figure out how to get some kind of plane out of here so that way I can get to this wedding and get to this rehearsal dinner and everything like that in reasonable time? And so the people are just like, you know what? No, there seems to be nothing that I can do. And so ultimately, we have it to where the girl is like, well, hey, can I speak to your supervisor? Because ultimately, like, this girl is trying to be as nice as possible, but this girl is just like, man, I don't really give an F today to really help you. So the girl tries to get a supervisor, and ultimately she gets a little angry, and that's when we get the security come in and deal her double damage if she ultimately keeps shouting in an airplane, to where like she's starting to dip within her numbers, and like further down within her numbers, and so ultimately she has to go and have a rent a car to ultimately now like desperately try to drive all the way to get to this wedding. And we have to where when this girl calls the bride to be to ultimately say, hey, yeah, I couldn't get my plane, but ultimately now I'm gonna just drive all the way there. And the girl's like, yeah, that's like 9 hours. Like, you're gonna have to drive for 9 hours to get here. Like, are you sure that you want to do something like that? And she's like, oh yeah, like I'll just make a fun thing out of it, because ultimately this bride is just like, well, yeah, you're kind of like, you're gonna miss the rehearsal dinner, and like, so like I really wanted you here. Like, should I just change and get another maid of honor? And the girl's like, no, 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 no. Like, I can sure make it, because this girl has rehearsed this speech that she's going to give at this wedding numerous times, faking crying and basically making up all these stories to ultimately make this girl look like $1 million. And even at some point, the girl is just like, yeah, like some parts of the speech I don't really like. Can you like take this out? And ultimately, she's like, yeah, sure, I'd love to. And so this girl has to re-rehearse the speech without parts of it in it, and ultimately try to yeah, I got a fake cry during this point, I got a fake cry during that point, and blah blah blah. And it's like, so pushing this girl to get a car that basically isn't even in English, and or isn't even in the right language. And so we have this girl who eventually has to uh, have this car get I guess battery, because we don't have gas in this car. It just goes off a battery. And so we have to where the girl ultimately has to go to this gas station attendant or battery station attendant to ultimately ask, like, hey, yeah, I can't get my car charged. Like, hey, is there any way that I can get my car charged? And so ultimately it's like, well, the guy mentions about like, well, like, yeah, you need a special adapter for that car. Sadly, I don't have that that car adapter on me because I don't care. And the entire time, the girl is listening because this guy has these headphones on way too loud. Ultimately, hearing full well that this guy is, of course, listening to people go at it, let's just say. And so she's just like, oh my God. Like, this guy is just the crappiest person. But I'm just going to be nice to him. So she gives him 5 stars, and he only gives him he only gives her like a 1 or a 2. And she ultimately is like, seriously? 2 stars? And he's like, it wasn't a meaningful encounter. And I'm like, God, like, this girl was going out of her way to be nice to you. And ultimately, he's just like, meh, F you anyways, because you inconvenienced me by having to come here and ask me a question. So, I have to where now this girl is asking, going to have to ask every single person if they have an adapter for her to use, and ultimately nobody has any of them. So ultimately, this girl has to very much try to manipulate her way into getting a car ride. Basically, having to have a person who is going to an RV that is going to some convention to desperately ask to, hey, can I bum a ride? And so justifiably, these people find out that it seems the more and more questions that they ask of her, the more and more it doesn't really seem like she knows much about the show that she said that she knew about. So, pushing us on to have this girl try to get out of this RV to eventually go and to seemingly meet this semi trucker that's like a 1.4. And so, this semi trucker has this story about man, like, I was probably a 4.6 at one point, and ultimately, uh, I was reasonably everything was going well for me. I found out that um, my husband was having cancer. I was like, oh, that's too bad. So ultimately, we were trying to treat his cancer and everything like that. And reasonably, I went to every doctor and 5-starred them. And ultimately, when every single time the cancer just kept getting worse, anyways, and to where ultimately, like, her husband was about to die, but if anything, the her husband was at a 4.3, and they gave her bed away, his bed away to a 4.4, and just sent him home to die. And so she ended up just got so fed up that she just tore through people and just reasonably just told all the doctors and everybody to finally just F off, because like she reasonably thought that they were crappy people. And so that's why she ended up being a 1.4, because ultimately you have the I think 2.6 that is ultimately just kind of looking through this girl's feed to ultimately find any red flags. And to where the semi trucker's like, oh, if you're gonna look through my feed, that's completely fine. I don't care. But yeah, so we have to where this girl eventually gets off this ride and seems to have to commandeer vehicles and try to desperately drive to this wedding as as much as she can, just kind of connive and just otherwise just do whatever she needs to do to make it to this wedding. And ultimately, you have the bride who is ultimately calling her, and it's like, yeah, you're 2.6. What happened? It's like, if anything, I'm not going to have you be my maid of honor. It's like, if anything, like you're 2.6 and I have like 4.5s here. They're going to freak if they end up seeing you around them. Like, there's no way that you're going to like be anywhere near my wedding. And so the girl's like, yeah, but I'm making so much time. I'm like, I'm an hour away and like I'm going to be there. And so she is flying, she's driving her way through using this like vehicle sorts to make it to this wedding. And she ends up making it to the wedding like right as it's ending, and and to the reception dinner where she ultimately makes this speech and goes off on the speech to ultimately just like, you know what, like this girl actually like stole my man and she stole everything from me, and ultimately she became better for it and dot. So reasonably, yeah, like this girl ends up going off to the point of her like skyrocketing downward to having everybody downvote her to where they pretty much annihilate her, to where she ends up just going to prison. And ultimately you have her and this other guy who is having a shouting match in prison, to ultimately just finally to give crap to one another. And I thought that that was an interesting exchange of like people just going like, you know what, I'm tired of being nice all the time because I have to be this overly fake person, that now I don't need to be this overly fake person, and good for me that I don't have to be that now. And so really that's what happens within that episode. I thought that it was really fun because ultimately when looking at it, you have this person has to be this overly fake person that has to be nice to everyone, and then it's finally just to the point to where it's like, you know what, like F this, like I've been so nice for so long, and like look where it's kind of like, look where it's taken me. Look to where like any tiny little mistake will cause me to spirally down, go down anyways, or just like I can't get to where I desperately need to find a higher or better life for me. So it's like, F it, I'll just end up like throwing it all in the trash and start over, and live a better life, I hope. So moving on to the next episode, where we ultimately have uh I'm gonna pause here for a second. All right, the next episode ultimately is playtest, and ultimately that episode we have it to where a guy ultimately who seemingly lives at home and is ultimately just kind of a backpacker, ultimately to seemingly go and have his influence maybe done on a social media of sorts, where he's consistently Instagramming his way to go to all these journeys, seeing Big Bens and seeing all these like cool, lavish like places. And ultimately, it seems like he is just kind of looking for odd jobs to just kind of get by, to keep him going on his adventures. And so really we have this guy who ends up landing his way into being able to get a job that goes into video game development. So we have this guy who otherwise justifiably goes into really testing out a video game, and it seems like he has some seemingly knowledge about some of the qualities of video games and stuff like that. So we have this company who is wanting to do things in secret, and so ultimately they have to give up people's phones or turn people's phones off before like they can't have any real equipment that ultimately can have people get any kind of information leaked out. But we have this main character who leaks out information anyways, sends out photos to ultimately um, leak out this equipment and stuff like that. So eventually we have it to where this girl ends up coming back, giving him this a little black circular thing on the back of his neck, and then ultimately we have it to where it's seemingly going to end up being like some kind of we end up having this apparatus being put in on the back of this guy's neck, and ultimately to lead to where now um, this guy is otherwise going into testing out this video game or not. He's not really sure what's real and what's not real, and so he meets the video game creator and ultimately is pushed into doing this video game called Scream. We have this video game that ultimately is to have people be put through this scenario where it's going to be more and more uncomfortable. Because at first he ends up trying out this one video game that's like a whack-a-mole kind of thing, which he keeps seeing this whack-a-mole like character consistently change and adjust to look even much more 3D and much more lifelike. And so he's like smacking the whack-a-moles, and he's like, "Wow, these are so cute, and oh, what a fun game!" But then he ends up being pushed into this game called Scream, where ultimately he is pushed to be much more uncomfortable every single time. Funny enough, this character is just like, yeah, I'm sure they probably just saw any number of things because they were just bored out of their mind. Because ultimately, once he gets into the game, he ends up just kind of going with this woman to go into this house where ultimately he starts seeing things, but ultimately he says like, yeah, I'm sure like there's no TV, there's no music, there's no nothing to kind of bide the time. So really, it's just like people probably just got bored to death, and that's why they started to just hallucinate and see things because they were just like so bored. So we have this guy who eventually goes throughout this game, and things that I think are going in his mind are ultimately things that I think the video game developers can't actually see, but I guess he can. Because ultimately, we have it to where he's going through this house, and every single thing that he is supposedly seeing, everything that is showing up on the camera is not actually there. So we have to where this guy, otherwise at first, seems to see this spider, and he's like, "Oh, hey, there's a spider here. I kind of hate spiders. That's great." So ultimately, we have it to where this spider comes like kind of crawling over this guy, and ultimately, I'm assuming I'm like, oh, okay, so we're gonna have a much bigger spider, but that never actually happens. It ends up that seems that this guy ends up crushing this spider, but the spider just vanishes. So we end up having it to where this guy ends up uh, crushing what he thinks is a spider, but the spider just goes away, and he's like, "Oh, okay, well that's kind of a weird thing to ultimately see." So we have to where eventually he goes into the house even more, and eventually he notices that some old bully of his when he was in school ultimately reappears in front of him, but the bully doesn't do anything. Basically, he just kind of like walks through him, and he's like, yeah, whatever. Hey, bully from school, isn't that great? And so reasonably, we have to where this guy is just kind of mocking the whole entire game because really he's just like, dude, this isn't actually really all that scary. It's just kind of to remind me of certain things and this and that to kind of make me uncomfortable. So we have this guy who is pushing on through this house, ultimately knowing full well when eventually he's going to get scared at some point or eventually when things are going to happen to him. So ultimately, at some point, we have this character who eventually gets thirsty and gets hungry, goes into the kitchen to get some wine and get some cookies and stuff like that. And reasonably, we have to where he knows when exactly he's going to get scared. He's like, you know what? I know that once you like open up these cupboards or something like that, something's going to jump out at me. And so ultimately, when we have the cupboard opening, we have the main character who's ultimately mentioning like, yeah, like I'm sure once I close this last cupboard, there's going to be something that is going to try to get me. So he ends up closing up the last cupboard after getting these cookies, and surefire enough, we see the shadow of his enemy, but what ends up popping out anyways is a giant spider with the head of his school like enemy, and he's like, "Oh my god, this is gross." And so ultimately, that is like the worst thing that happens in this episode, and I'm just like, God, that is like really gross. Um, but anyways, pushing us on, like we're seeing that the guy's girlfriend, that ultimately he had lived with her, and ultimately told her some things about his mother and told her some kind of personal stuff and this and that. Ultimately, that his father was dealing with Alzheimer's and he was taking care of him, but his father ended up dying. So this girl supposedly reappears in the game to ultimately tell him, it's like, hey, this game isn't safe. There's something wrong going on. He's like, whoa, 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 what are you talking about? So it eventually leads us to, like, it seems like this girl is protecting him, but then also it seems that she has her own real agenda because he is kind of taken off guard by her. And so what ends up happening is she ends up, because he was kind of confused because this girl isn't actually something that he can just kind of like put his hand through. It's like, no, this girl's actually solid. I can actually touch her and whatever. So, like, I'm a little confused, like, what's going on with this game now. So, we have this girl who is eventually going to the kitchen and then eventually grabbing a knife. And ultimately, that's when our character gets a little bit uncomfortable. Supposedly, the tester ultimately told him that he wouldn't be able to feel anything. Well, he ended up feeling a knife that goes right into his back, and because ultimately he is taken off guard by this girl because he thought that she was protecting him, but ultimately instead she ends up pushing him to the ground, pushing this knife further into this guy's back, and then her face turns into like this Attack on Titans looking face that ultimately like turns into this like meat, or like it feels like her skin is turning inside out. And so reasonably you have it to where our main character ends up taking the knife that is now uh, popping out of his shoulder. He ends up taking the girl's head and pushing her head into the knife, killing her. And so ultimately, he pushes the body off of him, and he's like, "Oh my god!" I like, stop, stop, stop. And ultimately repetitiously at some point just kind of being done because he's like, dude, I wasn't supposed to feel anything and I felt the knife go in my back. Like, you guys lied to me. Like, what is going on? And so, because really ultimately the girl said, okay, what's going to be the safe word? And ultimately the guy simply said, it's like, well, shouldn't the safe word just be stop? Like, shouldn't that just be the safe word? Like, stop. And so really, yeah, this guy repetitiously saying stop, 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 like, I'm done, like, stop this. And because ultimately he said that he shouldn't have felt pain, and he did. He saw the knife go in his back, and the entire time these game developers are like, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't see that. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Ba 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 ba. So we have to where we have to where the person is just kind of done with this game, and ultimately we have to where the developer is telling them, it's like, well, if you just go into this safe room, then we'll get you out of the game. And so the guy's like, well, okay, sure. But he opens the door and is like, yeah, it's like, you guys, like, if anything, this game will know that I have something like I have issues with my mother, and ultimately the game is gonna do that. And so reasonably we have it to where the he opens this door anyways to go into this room, and the game developer is like, "Oh well, yeah, like this isn't a safe room. We're just gonna continue this game and this and that, just basically like effing with this guy because we don't know if this person is really talking to him or not, or if all this is in his head, or what's all going on." So we have to where this game developer is trying to have this guy describe his mother to, or this main character guy is trying to uh, be asked by this game developer to describe his mother to him, and it's like, dude, he's not gonna do that. Like he's not gonna try to get suckered in like that. To where ultimately, once he describes and thinks about her, that ultimately the game is going to put that in the game. So recently, it just ends up that he ends up getting more and more terrified and or scared to where he breaks the window, or he breaks the mirror in his room, and ultimately at some point more and more and more that this guy gets so terrified that he eventually slowly but surely also losing all of his memory to the point where he doesn't even know who he is anymore, and you just have the person that ended up uh, the game developer and the girl that did this whole game is ultimately just scramblingly running in there and getting him out of the game. He gets out of the game, and ultimately he's just like, God, what the F just happened in there? And ultimately the girl mentions like, you were only in there for like a second. Like you were only in there for like very little time. Like this game is far too powerful, and we have to kind of figure out a way to like tone this game down because it escalates way too far. So we have it uh, to where the guy is just kind of mortified and by this whole experience, and recently he ends up like driving his way home, and like everything seems to be fine, but it seems like he is also still in the game again. To ultimately, we just find out at the very end of this episode that reasonably he ended up dying in this game because what had happened was is that his phone went off, and and because he went home to talk to his mom to just kind of reconcile some things, and ultimately his phone went off while he was actually playing the game. He was still inside the game, and his phone going off had killed him because he had kept yelling "ma ma ma ma," and then that ultimately like effed up his brain to where it killed him because his phone had went off. So it's kind of like what would happen if you left your phone off while a plane was going and going, because ultimately they tell you to kill all electronical devices and everything like that. But ultimately, they kind of do the same thing to him in the very beginning of this playtest episode, where ultimately he's playing a game while the plane is landing, and like he talks to some girl as like a roller coaster, like, yeah, hey, put your hands up because it's really fun. So to kind of make this girl more comfortable during this flight. So yeah, that's kind of the whole premise of this. Like, hey, turn off your electrical devices, or otherwise you're gonna die. So, leading into the next episode, which is, I think it's called like "Shut Up and Dance," where recently we have it to where we have people that are being controlled by seemingly a camera or a visual device from somewhere, ending up hacking through people's social medias, or hacking through any number of things, hacking through people's online website, whatever's, and ultimately just getting dirt on people. So ultimately they can use them for some game. Ultimately, when looking at this, I feel like this episode kind of feels like the movie 13 Sins, which I've recently seen. So we have some we have some boy who ends up going in and ends up dropping trow in front of a laptop camera, and we end up finding out that this guy is going to be blackmailed by this person that is texting him, telling him that, hey, like, uh, you need to you need to do this thing for us, or we're going to leak this video because ultimately we saw what you did last night. So we have to where this guy goes onto this journey to, like, at first he has to leave his job to go and retrieve this cake, which ultimately leads him to go to this hotel room to meet this guy to also be a part of this game. And we find out that this guy is going to be blackmailed as well, because ultimately he is cheating on his wife. And so recently we have to where this guy is also going to be incorporated in the game, and he's going to be driving this younger guy to rob a bank. Rob a bank, get a lot of money, and ultimately we have to where the older guy is pushing this younger kid to rob this bank because ultimately he's like, man, like if like I'm gonna keep telling you to do all of this uh, because I need to desperately do all this, or otherwise, like, my wife's gonna leave me and take my kids, and I can't let that happen. Like, I'm gonna off myself if that ends up happening. So, like, I gotta forcibly do all this stuff, because the thing that they blackmailed the one guy for is that he like he's married to a woman, but eventually I guess he just gets bored. So eventually he just sacked up with a younger 20-year-old girl, and because recently it's like, dude, I just get bored. So recently he ends up he's been cheating on his wife. So ultimately they found out about that, and now they're because ultimately he had some website where he chatted with this younger girl, and that ultimately led to him having private sessions with this girl in some hotel somewhere. So ultimately we find out that the boy ultimately just ended up uh, having a video of him jerking it, beef jerking. So recently it's like, oh well, that's all that they got on you. That's not really going to ruin your life. If anything, yeah, if it ends up going out there like that you did this, it's like if anything, like yeah, you're going to get humiliated, and people are going to treat you like garbage, and like this and that. But like, if anything, it's not going to completely ruin your life. Like, people will probably have uh, your uh, your climax face on their social media somewhere. But if anything, it's like to just like mock you. But we end up having it to where they end up doing this bank robbery, as well as trying to also get this girl to some. Because ultimately, we have to where this guy has to lie while meeting an old friend of his at this gas station. So ultimately, lie to say that he has a nephew, which I thought was hilarious. And ultimately, he's like, "Yeah, I'm gonna get him to the train station." And the girl's like, "Well, hey, I'm going to right around there, so can you drop me off?" So everything about this thing is a timing thing, or ultimately the people are telling them, it's like, hey, you're going the wrong way. It's like, if anything, if you need to be here by X amount of time, or we're going to leak the videos. And so recently they are now chasing to get this girl to the drop off point, and then racing to get to where they have to be picked up, or where they have to go, and then ultimately that's when they rob the bank, and then that's ultimately where pushing on to have the car being burnt up, and the boy has to now uh, go and drop off the money somewhere. So we have the money being dropped off somewhere, and ultimately leading to meeting another guy. Because ultimately, every single person that this kid meets ultimately is tied to some other person in a portion of this game. To ultimately have to do photos or other things. So confirming that they saw this person, giving him a cake that ultimately uh, he has to pull out a thing from this cake to ultimately say, hey, yeah, you're gonna rob this bank. So pushing on to having now this kid fight this guy to the death, and ultimately find out that both of these people had both done the same crime of sorts. We find out that both of these people had ultimately been jerking it, but to, let's just say, the wrong kind of photos, ultimately leading them into being being guys that otherwise are going to be like really shamed if they go and have these videos being leaked out. But really, either one of them are going to have to fight to the death anyway, so what does it exactly matter? So these people both fight to the death. We have the younger boy who eventually gets the upper hand on this other guy and kills him. And while this boy is walking home, because the guy that this boy was with was ultimately like, well, hopefully we meet again someday. So we have to where this we have to where now these people all go home for their days. Every single person that is otherwise tied to all these things that they had to go and do. We ultimately find out that everything gets leaked regardless. That every single thing ends up showing up to someone somewhere. We find out that the guy who ends up cheating when he goes home, he has his wife find out about everything, and is now upset with him. We find out that some girl who ended up being uh, this thing ends up we finding out that she had like some kind of racist comment that people are now going to find out about. The guy who ends up sending the one kid the cake, he was also tied to this, and he is going to be found out about as well, and so on and so forth. The boy who ended up winning the match, he ultimately will be uh, getting a call from his mother saying, "Oh my God, all your friends and I know all of which that you had done. How could you?" Ba 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 ba, and to the point where everyone's going to find out about everything. And so reasonably, it ends up being to where like all of this to push someone to do all this crazy stuff, where in the end, like it's just gonna blow up in their faces after all this, and it's just like, man, like people have to do these little tasks just to have it just like, well, the thing that we blackmailed you on, we're just gonna leak it anyways. Like we blackmailed you this whole time to do all these projects to basically fight to the death, but it doesn't matter because we're gonna leak this anyways. So that's kind of the horrible thing of like, there's some stuff that probably I guess could be a crime or whatever, but like reasonably like I guess it's like, hey, never do anything bad in your life because eventually it'll like come back to haunt you. Because every single time, like reasonably, I guess if you're a higher celebrity in life or whatever, people will find dirty stuff about you, and it's like, oh well, like there's nothing I could do about it, and like there's a lot of times where ultimately people, you'll find out information and stuff about them anyway. It's gonna happen. Um, and it's just like, oh well, yeah, like that was a time in my life where ultimately I made a lot of mistakes, and like now I'm gonna try to be better, and I'm gonna try to like whatever, because really there's any number of celebrities that it's ultimately just like, oh, this is the pinnacle of them being like the highest that they can possibly be, so I'm gonna release some photos, or I'm gonna release something of them saying some crap when they were like 2 years old, and stuff that they didn't really quite understand when they were younger, and now I'm going to release some crap about them that they said at some point to use against them, and it's horrible, but at the end of the day it's just meh. Everybody has dirt on themselves, and ultimately it's just like meh, it happens. So recently going into the very last episode, really this last episode I think is probably the most boring episode out of all of them. This episode really is just, you have these people that ultimately, you have this girl that is in supposedly this world, and she ends up, of course, like, we find out that like they can't die in this world, that they can kind of like fall into a 10-story fall off a like seemingly 10-story building and be completely fine. They can just walk away from it. And it's like, oh, okay, so this is to tell us that this world isn't the real world, it's some virtual world to tell us that like these people are getting towards the end of their life, and so they're going to virtually have as much fun as they can, be in a relationship, and ultimately have people take care of them before they actually need to die. And so you have this girl that seems to have been in this virtual world for far too long, to where one girl is trying to retrieve her back to ultimately say, hey, like, we were lovers at some point. You don't remember this, but and so now, like, I'm gonna have to reel you back in to let you know, hey, you're dying soon, and so like I'm gonna let you know that I'm gonna take care of you, and then you're gonna die. And so reasonably, we have to where these young women are actually much elderly people in the real world, and they are eventually getting to the point to where they are going to die legitimately in real world. And so recently these people are living off their elderly lives as younger people and stuff like that. So that whole story I thought was really interesting, but then again I thought it was also like really boring. I was like, man, I kind of recently saw the movie like Mr. Nobody with Jared Leto. Well, not recently, I saw that at some point. And so recently, while watching that movie with Jared Leto, like that kind of reminded me of this episode. And so recently, I was like, yeah, like that is basically like this episode is basically that whole movie, but shortened down, but having a relationship between two women and leading us to really believe that this world isn't actually a real world. It's just a a world before death, before these people are at the end of their lives, that are just kind of like holding on to things, and somebody has to retrieve them back, to ultimately say, "Hey, you're actually going to die soon in your real body, so I'm gonna make your transition a little bit better because like we used to be lovers before, we used to be whatever before. I'm gonna remind you about your past, your old life." So that's kind of easily how that last episode goes into. I think and eventually it seems that both these people are kind of at the end of their lives, and so really they have to have people like figure out how to take care of them and figure out how uh, to die, because reasonably we have it to where like these people weren't actually like lovers before, but eventually in the real world, but eventually become lovers in this virtual world, because recently I think they had like husbands before all this, but then eventually with this virtual world, like they are now just kind of like, we don't have our husbands here because I guess they left us or whatever, so we're going to be lovers here and this actual world and this and that. So very interesting episode, but at the end of the day I don't really care to say much about it. I could probably ultimately just talk about the rest of this season and finish this review off, but like I don't really quite remember the last couple episodes all that clearly, and so recently it would just be me like muttering through things that I just don't quite remember exactly. And like I think the last episode of this season, ultimately I don't remember anything about it at all. Um, like when looking at it, I'm like, yeah, I probably end up seeing this episode, but I think it didn't do anything for me, and because I ultimately know the episode that comes right after this, because I'm like, hey, this girl that ultimately was in this episode that comes up after this is like, hey, this is the girl from Orange is the New Black. and she ended up dying in that show. And ultimately, she's in this episode, and I'm like, yeah, like I liked the episode that comes after this. So eventually, I'll review that, and then finish up season three, and then ultimately talk about season four and finish that all up. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.